Good afternoon. Welcome to this evening's lecture in the College of Environment and Design at the University of Georgia. This book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, was published in 1961. Jacobs begins with this statement: this book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. Since then, her book was regarded by many as one of the most influential narratives on urban planning and urbanism. My name is Ümit Yılmaz. I'm a professor and coordinator of the Urban Planning and Design program in this college. It is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dean Sonia Hirt. She had her undergraduate degree in architecture from Sofia and received a master's and doctoral degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Michigan. She has been an internationally renowned scholar in the area of urban planning and design theory, urban history, form, and land use, published more than 80 books and more than 2,000 citations. Dean Hirt first engaged with Jacobs' writing and practice about a decade ago, leading to her 2012 and 14 edited volume entitled Urban Wisdom of Jane Jacobs. Today, she will discuss the enduring relevance of Jacobs' ideas with current urban issues on this lecture, learning from Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 60 years later. The lecture will be followed by the questions and answers that will be asked via chat or question and answer. Sonia, welcome.
Thank you, Ümit, very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And just in case not everyone heard, we were late a few minutes here because of a technical difficulty, and we really appreciate your patience. But you know, always well that ends well. So it appears that now everything is going to be just fine. So let me just share my screen. My intention is to actually lecture technically for a relatively short period of time and actually have an engaging discussion at the end. So I actually end with some questions that I hope we can discuss, but of course I'm delighted to answer other questions just as well. So one sec. All right, is that visible or not visible?
Yes, we're good to go. Looking good.
All right, perfect, excellent. So thank you again for joining. I can see that it's a beautiful afternoon outside, and perhaps, you know, there are many other things to do better, but I think the topic we're discussing for those of us interested in the built environment is eternally important. And I stress the importance of Jacobs herself, not really so much the books that have been written about her. And sadly, or maybe happily, I contributed to one of them in the recent past. So the question is exactly as Ümit posed it. What explains the enduring legacy of the Jacobs School of Thought? A book that came out in the year 1961 simply has been the most heavily cited volume, at least published in English, that was created in the second half of the 20th century. It was extremely controversial at the very beginning, but has, I believe, to a large extent, achieved popularity and recognition that is unparalleled compared to any other author who wrote at that time. I also want to acknowledge that most of the images I worked with my graduate assistant, Saba Serkel, who is going to be soon graduating, one of our best students, and wish her the best of luck in her future endeavors. And she, in many ways, is a co-author of this presentation. So this is just a sampling of the books that have been written about the works of Jane Jacobs, and they are not all about the book that we're talking about, The Death in Life. Many are more comprehensive and evaluate her legacy more broadly, but the overwhelming majority actually are about the death in life. This is really the book with which Jacobs was able to change a paradigm. And I think to her own small regret, she wasn't able to achieve the same with books that she wrote later, and which she herself thought as more important than the death in life. Jacobs, probably one of the most accomplished people of the born in the first half of the century, at least in Scranton, Pennsylvania. She might very well be the second most famous person who have been born in this city. And she moved to New York in the 1930s with her sister to start a new life. She did not have a formal training in any of the disciplines that we regard today as, the design disciplines. And that was not because she didn't want to, at least at the time, but rather that she enrolled at Columbia at Barnard, which is connected to Columbia, and at Columbia University. But at that time, Columbia University did not issue degree to women. So she took a very rich range of classes, but none of them actually, the combination of classes she took did not lead to a degree, which was an obstacle for her. She overcame it, but it was an obstacle because all the people who had degrees perceived her as being a dilettante. She didn't really know what she was talking about. And of course, who has the last laughter here is the question. So if you just look at the variety of titles, all written by Jacobs, you perhaps will notice that really only the first book is very directly related to designing cities. There are three: the economy of cities, the wealth of nations, cities and the wealth of nations, and the nature of economies, where Jacobs truly attempted to contribute to economics. She called economics at some point a dismal science. She disagreed with many of the dominant ideas of her time, but her book did not penetrate the economics society to the very same extent to which I think it impacted the design professions. She has three books that I think, in addition to the Death in Life and the economics books, that I would say are probably best described as either political science or political ethics. And again, for reasons that we probably should discuss, somehow they did not resonate so profoundly. I mean, these are very famous books. It's just that the Death in Life is elevated at such a high standard that it remained the book that people associate Jacobs with. Another thing about Jacobs is that she was not just a theorist. I mean, assuming that to be a theorist is a bad thing, it's of course not. The point is that she actually carried many of her own theoretical findings, which she supported with empirical data. She took them, so to say, to the street. So she became a very important activist. It's difficult to describe her politically. She actually worked for a Cold War journal at a point. She also worked for the Q, the Vogue, the Architectural Forum. But she was perceived as to be of the left. And then what is the left is a complex question. So anyway, she was perceived this way. But this would be a bit of a narrow definition, I think. And she spent years of her life actually advocating for the ideas that she had put down earlier in writing. She lived in New York for most of her, these formative years when she wrote The Death and Life and some of the others, but eventually moved to Toronto. And this is partially because she was a very strong proponent of the peace movement. She did not feel home anymore when the Vietnam War was going on. And also she had two sons who she believed could be drafted. So this prompted her exit to Toronto. And I think for the rest of her life, she identified as American and Canadian at the same time. But she was a very prominent, what today you'd call advocate of historic preservation, vibrant old cities, and she actually very successfully was able to mobilize citizens and stop some projects that otherwise probably would have really hurt the fabric of New York City. Just like Omid said, the Death and Life, it's not a, Jane Jacobs was not a shy person, let's put it this way. She's extremely forceful critique of the urban planning paradigms and generally the design professions of her time. And the book written by a grant from Rockefeller, underwritten, started just like Omid said, it's an attack on city planning. There isn't like some nice rosy introduction in which, we are talking about good people and good cities and happiness and what we need to do. It's a very, very direct attack. And as you can see, this is the Times advertisement from the time. That was her claim that city planning, which of course existed to improve urban life, is doing the opposite of improving urban life. She actually compared city planning as it was practiced at the time, and not just at the time, for the history of the modern planning profession, say since 1850, to be like the medieval science of bloodletting. Supposedly the doctors were helping the patient, but they were actually harming the patient, so the patient could not recover using the gifts of their own nature. So it is very strange that, a book that was so, how should I say, forcefully critical in just a few years turned the paradigm around so much that it became the book, to the point that if you're actually not a fan of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, you are dissident, at least in the urban planning world. And maybe that's, maybe that too is a problem. And hopefully we can discuss more at the end. Her major, kind of to put the contribution very simply in 2 words, her point was that, cities are very complicated. She calls them organized complexities. But city planning, since the invention of modern city planning, in the United States, how do you date it? 1890, in France, 1850, let's say. The way the experts thought about how to reform the city was misreading the complexity of the city. So they perceive city problems as bivariate. Okay, people are not so happy, they're not so healthy, so therefore let's give them more green space. We can calculate what is the average square feet that we should provide to each person. Here it is, it's done, therefore people will be happier and healthier. And so her point was that cities are very complex organisms, and coming up with a very simple formula to improve any aspects of a city life, whether it's economics or equality, any aspect could not be thought of as a series of bivariate equations. It just doesn't work that way. So therefore, city planning was actually doing more harm by reducing complexity than, honestly, and that's the way she phrased it, then if you just left the city alone without any city plan. It's a very I think, devastating point of view to those, as we'll see, who were in, well, positions of power in the urban planning and policy world at the time. So without going through various paradigms that I think we can agree existed in modern urban planning, you know, if you compare the city beautiful to the modern city, the language is very different, the architecture, the means of expression, but her point was that it doesn't matter, that there is no principal difference between, let's say, Daniel Burnham and Corbusier, because both of them are trying to start a tabula rasa world in which, you know, everything is designed, and that is exactly the problem, that we are over designing, so to say. So she coined the term about urban planning, is several decades of history at that point, as the radiant garden city beautiful. And you normally don't see all three paradigms in one expression, but there she did it, and it has stayed with us ever since. Well, this was not well received, you know. It was not very well received at the beginning, especially. She had a number of very important nemesis, so to say, of which it would, you know, be too long to talk about them individually. But these are some of her most prominent, either intellectual or practical nemesis. Moses obviously was the one she clashed most famously in New York on a number of occasions. She won some of those battles. Mumford, they had a kind of a hot-cold relationship. You know, sometimes he would warm up to her, then, you know, sometimes he would say things that clearly showed his very passionate disagreement. Ed Bacon, here on my screen at the lower left, is her, I would say, closest to being her contemporary. And I think the contrast between the two of them is especially interesting. The story of the Death and Life is actually that she was visiting Philadelphia. She observed some of the urban renewal projects at the time, and she was not pleased that there was something based on her long-term ethnographic observations of New York and other cities, and Philadelphia at that time when Ed Bacon was the chief planner, that there was something wrong about this. This whole idea of taking down a significant portion of the old urban fabric and replacing it with new built forms. They looked clean and tall and like sculptures, like I said, in a garden. But for some reason, the level of orderliness reminded her of a cemetery. And, you know, cemeteries are not for living people generally, and cities are. So that is really her principal objection, I believe, that she raised. And again, this was not something that these particular four men or others who were in positions of power in terms of city planning were very happy at the time. So this is some of the language that was used. You can see that there was a kind of a very strong, I believe, gender element to the critique. Some appear to have been very personal attacks. You know, she's the enchanted ballerina, coffee house Rambo. She's not an expert, that's the point. Her living in a city, observing it, writing about it, did not equal the expertise that the people in power at the time had. So, you know, she was militant, crazy, and so forth and so forth. So I don't know how personally hurtful this was to her. Even if it was, she persisted, didn't stop, promoted her ideas, both through her activism, as well as her ideas in other books, although the other books are not, again, like I said earlier, not necessarily so oriented towards understanding the urban fabric and actually proposing a way in which it could improve. In my opinion, and you can find perhaps other contrasts, but to understand the depth to which she shifted a paradigm, and she didn't shift it by herself. I mean, you know, pretty much from the same time, we have several other important works in landscape architecture, in sociology, and in other disciplines, and, you know, feminist thought, the civil rights movement. So she's, of course, I'm not claiming that she changed urban thinking by herself, but she certainly contributed more to changing this paradigm than probably any other person of her time. And I've always think the best other book that you can read, where you can see how different she was than what was dominant at her time, is the one right here, The Design of Cities, by Ed Bacon. I think he's a little bit younger than her. His book is written just a few years later, but supposedly this is definitely the same generation of urban thinkers, and Ed Bacon, of course, was extremely highly accomplished. And without going through the book, he proposed 8 principles, for those of you who remember this book, which he thought are to be abided by in designing cities, and that itself is important, to design cities. And she did not quite think that you have to design it to the point of over-designing it, but we can talk about more about this in a second. So he had these beautiful sketches. You know, it's we do have the book in the library, and through which he proposed the 8 ways in which cities should relate to the rest of the world. And I think that it's easy to note from the sketches alone, and also by the titles underneath the 8 principles, he was, I would say, perceiving the city as some sort of as a sculpture of a type. He's concerned how the city or its buildings meet the sky, they meet the ground, designing depth, and so forth and so forth. And all of it appears to have been focused on physical form of buildings. And only in his 8th principle does he actually speak of the relationship between cities and humans. And I think this is exactly what Jane Jacobs disagreed with. This sort of from her point of view, a narrowly aesthetic vision of the city is a collection of beautiful buildings, which, if designed properly, will somehow, you know, help human health and happiness afterwards. And that is a point that she certainly disagreed with. So the city is an art project. You know, I get my brushes, and here's the canvas, and I'll paint it. Something which I think Corbusier, 30 years before Bacon, says very, very well in his 1929 book. And that is exactly what she was opposing, a paradigm which by her time, however, had become by far the most dominant one. So in Corbusier's work, man has a tendency towards pure geometry, or what we would call order. And as we move forward toward a more perfect order, the result in urban form is a work of art. So is the city a work of art, a complicated art nonetheless, but can it be seen as an art project? And I think Jacobs' most principal opposition to this is that I suppose it'll be okay to be an art object if we have many artists. And I think that's what urban living is about. I mean, everyone's an artist in a way. But I think her disagreement was with this vision that there could be an artist who can really see best for all of us, and with this single stroke design can actually improve urban living. So Jane Jacobs wrote most of the book as critique. It was an attack on city planning. But in, I would say, the latter third of the book, or maybe it's about half, she began to propose a couple solutions. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. This is something for us to discuss. These became the most cited part of the book. I mean, I've noticed, you know, for the years that I've been working with other people interested in Jane Jacobs, when they assign chapters in syllabi, it always turns out that these 4 chapters that talk about 4 basic physical principles of how to plan a good city are the most commonly used in syllabi. They're also the most quoted ones. So somehow this complicated, vibrant critique, which the New York Times called a piece of literature, the entire book, somewhat became subsided by these 4 chapters Jacobs calls the generators of urban diversity, which now everyone recognizes because since that time they've become the dominant paradigm themselves. So her point was that the modern approach to segregating commerce from residence and from industry does not work. It creates cities that are not used at 24/7. It creates a lot of emptiness. And it's not even economically beneficial. That the modern idea of having super blocks is extremely harmful. It's just like bloodletting in old-fashioned medicine, because planners thought of streets as avenues for traffic as opposed to places where people, not cars, make casual encounters, they talk to each other, and who knows what ideas happen. So she believed that actually a city has to be rich in corners. Lots of corners means short streets that intersect more commonly than not. She was not a big fan of modern architecture, and that's a soft way of putting it. She did not say that, but I'm saying it this way. She thought kind of eclecticism is the architecture or urbanism of democracy. You got to have things from all ages of various sizes. You shouldn't really have one style or one type dominate it all. I mean, eclecticism is really what she thought is a major generator of diversity in cities, both physical and therefore, as she makes the argument, social. Her last, perhaps most cited contribution is that she argued for density at a time when it was very well accepted that actually it would be much better if cities would decentralize, if density is reduced. This is to prevent overcrowding, to make people healthier, allow them more green space so they can live in a park and so forth and so forth. So the whole city would be a park. And I think this is one of the 4 principles that most clearly penetrate the field of economics. In economics, actually, people use a term which is called Jacobs density, and you know, there are all kinds of models that actually test, you know, what density is beneficial to, you know, some economics purpose. So anyway, so these 4 principles, I don't know that they dominate the book, but I think that they dominated the perception of the book. And I am here to argue that this is a narrow interpretation of the importance of the book and its core and what its major contribution actually to life is. There are many other terms that she coined that somehow are very popular, but very heavily cited, but did not, I guess they're not solutions. The 4 principles which she proposed, mixed use, you know, concentration, and the other 2, they're like a solution. It's a complex book, problem defined, do those 4 things. She introduced a number of other concepts that are very important, and they have become kind of, you know, defining not the design disciplines necessarily, but also of sociology, cultural geography, eyes on the street, which is related to mixed primary uses, because, you know, the best way to, in essence, protect the city from crime, she believed, will be by people naturally observing other people by being at their window. You know, a simple idea that was kind of scorned at her time, because it was assumed that, you know, you withdraw in your suburban home and that's where you have peace, and you're not watching other people at night because they're just not helpful. So this became a very important theory in criminology. And there's been a lot of testing, empirical, quantitative, and qualitative, and, you know, with kind of mixed results. I mean, some people say that it doesn't work this way. I mean, eyes on the street is just one contributing factor. Some people say, no, it was really profound and prophetic. Another very important term she used is the street ballet. This is kind of the idea that it's not a solution. Maybe people know about it, but it's not as, I guess, so much discussed in city planning schools. The idea that, you know, casual encounters on the street are not so casual. There is an internal order. Some people show up at sometime, some people show at another time. There is a dance to this. It's a very complicated dance, collective dance that does not necessarily, it's not led by, there is no editor, or if there is, there are many. And so there's a lot of complexity to it, which we, as, you know, people trying to do the best they can to design a city, are probably not capturing. And perhaps we shouldn't even try to capture it, because a lot of the dynamism in urban form is coming from the fact that it has this internal artistic logic. And that's kind of an interesting thing, that she was again against necessarily the city being an art project. So it seemed this would be a misconception, but some people say this. I mean, she was against art. Well, of course she wasn't against art. She just says that the city is not art. But then she found a musical metaphor to actually sum up urban life. So, you know, it's I think one of the ironies of the ideas that she was proposing. So my interest in Jane Jacobs, which started many years ago, longer than I wish to remember, and I am still not done with it. I actually gave a couple lectures at other places, and I'm kind of trying to write another piece now with a different twist, is that my claim is that we misunderstand Jane Jacobs and the Dead and Life specifically if we think that her contribution was how to better design cities. My read of the importance of the book, what's the core of the book, is that it's actually a more philosophical project than that. And that's why I've chosen to use this quotation, 1991, from the very famous German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, nothing to do with Jane Jacobs. But he was saying that you can judge the entire project of modernity, broadly speaking, the 18 and 1900s. And, you know, that's a long debate of how to date it. But if you just imagine that modern thought is held at the judicial hearing, there is a single most important question that actually the jury would be making their decision on, and this is, how is reliable knowledge possible? And this is a question that I think this is the true contribution of Jane Jacobs, that she shifted the way in which we look at cities, which are the object of knowing. If you're going to do anything about it, you first have to establish some parameters of what there is to know, and also how to know it. And these are actually contributions, in my opinion. This is the paradigm shift between Ed Bacon and others and Jane Jacobs, is that she's shifting what to know, which is a project in ontology, what to know, and also how to know it, which is a project of epistemology, and also who to know it. I mean, who will know best? Would it be people who are professionally trained? Would it be people who live there? Would it be people who live in the countryside? I mean, there are many propositions, but must you have some expertise to actually issue prescriptions, or could your prescriptions be even hurt, as she did claim at the time? Your the accuracy of your understanding, could it be actually hampered by the fact that you have a formal expertise? So I don't really know exactly what's the answer to these questions, but my claim here is that this is the true contribution that the book made, and that's why it's appealing not only to design professions, and yes, most heavily cited in the design professions, but why people read it beyond anything that has to do with cities. And I mean, after all, that's what the New York Times said. It's not a study. It's a piece of literature, and that is itself kind of a problematic thing, because some people say, well, that's because she was not scientific. And then there's this whole debate of what is a scientist and what is science, and is social science quantifiable, and so forth and so forth. So all these things that hopefully we will try to consider. Well, some of them, not all. So I think that the book shifted the paradigm in what is to know in terms of cities, how to know it, just like I said, and who can know it. And I have just chosen some citations. Most of them are from this book, but some of them are from her speeches as well. And I think that they do show how she changed the thinking paradigm. And I think that's really the most persuasive part of the book. So here's how simple this is. I think that she used this in a speech that she gave at the Graduate School of Design. That's all there is. A store is a storekeeper. Planners, economists, sociologists, landscape architects tended to count shops in some ratio versus residencies, or their economic impact or something else. And she's saying, no, the object of your study should not be the store. The object of your study should be the storekeeper. So she's humanizing the object of study, and this is an ontological shift, because she shows you what is important to know about. So it's the storekeeper, not the store. I mean, her last chapter is about what kind of a problem a city is. That definitely is, in my opinion, an ontological way of putting it. I mean, what is there to understand to begin with? What kind of a problem is it? Her claim that I already mentioned, that cities are not art, and it is actually harmful to see them as artistic projects, at least if we have a very limited amount of artists who are participating. And her general advocacy throughout the whole book, that it is perfectly possible that the human mind, or the group of the best minds anywhere, might not be able to grasp the complexity of reality as it is. And so just because we cannot see something as orderly, like the street ballet, does not mean that actually there is not an internal logic which may be just too big for us to comprehend at the moment. But many of the urban interventions are done with this idea of oh my God, it's too disorderly. Let's fix it. Let's order it. And I think this is I think a very major contribution that she made to human thought, not urban planning, not landscape architecture, not architecture, none of the specific disciplines that generally, not historic preservation, generally to human thought. These are, all citations from the book. So this has been also very controversial. So all she does, that school of thought says, the critical of Jen Jacobs, she's just observing people. I mean, this is because she's a journalist. Well, I mean, this probably is true. I mean, she was a journalist. She, worked for a number of magazines. So she was more urbanist, certainly, than she was an architect, preservationist, or a landscape architect. I mean, that is who she was. So there is this general critique that it's not scientific. She can't extract any theory, but that is her. I think this is also misreading. I mean, she's very clear that she's not trying to study averages. So she's not using a method comparable to statistics, which generally relies on the study of averages, but rather to find patterns And these patterns, although they vary greatly from a city to city and from big cities to small cities, and of course they vary culturally and geographically, there is still something to observing facts and actually figuring out generalizable principles, but from the particular to the general and not the other way, that allowed her to build what are some theoretical contributions. So I think this is perhaps the time for me to stop with what I think the importance of this book has been, and pose a few questions, which I don't insist we focus on. I'm happy to discuss any other topic that seems more pertinent. But generally the critique, and some of it I think is actually very, on point, should be readdressed. And some of the critiques, as I've outlined them here in 4 simple question marks, is that I don't know whether it's actually the original thought that she shared that is being criticized, or rather how she was interpreted and followed by others. This probably happens to many important scientists and philosophers in all disciplines, that they propose something, then it gets interpreted, and at the end of the day it's not clear who we are blaming for the failure. Is it the person who came up with the idea, or is it the followers who misunderstood it? So that's kind of a perpetual problem, I guess. So one of the critiques, I think, a relatively valid one, and I don't know, is it interpretation or misinterpretation, but her entire desire at the end of the day with this book to propose physical principles, better city planning principles, I wonder whether she falls into the very same school of thought that she called the Radiant Garden City beautiful in her own way. I mean, there is an assumption, if you read the text, that if you design it somehow better, I mean, more complex, more participatory, whatever, somehow social life would improve. And that's, also referred to as physical determinism. And whether this is her or, again, her successors, I think that's a debate we can have. There's also has been for many years a kind of a concern about people, interpreting the book, is that she misunderstood the importance of actual structural inequality. I mean, she somehow makes a point in her book that practically all problems should be best solved at the urban level. And in her urban economics books, actually, this is the major point. She was saying, I mean, kind of changing the paradigm in urban history and economics at the same time by saying that actually the city should be the basic unit of analysis, as opposed to, for example, the nation state. And so she was assuming that, social problems can be solved at the urban level, but some people would say that this is actually overambitious, that when a society has very deep problems, economic, social inequalities, you actually cannot deal with them at the urban level alone, because these are systemic problems. So that's perhaps a valid critique. This one, I feel it's a little bit, we can kind of more excuse her from this side. I mean, some people, articles written that she was the kind of original champion of gentrification, which has, of course, is a very problematic trend. I don't know necessarily that this is anything that she would have liked to have happened. Rather, she made cities fashionable. There it is, with one book, you made cities fashionable. So I think it's probably definitely an unintended consequence, but and I don't think we should blame her for that. But anyway, this school of thought also exists, and ultimately, like I said a little earlier, there's a lot of emphasis in the Death and Life, but also in her speeches and her other statements, that okay, cities are too complex, maybe, you know, too complex for us to comprehend. And yet at the same time, here are my principles. So, oh, first of all, things are complex. So, you know, maybe we should just say we don't know and do very small interventions. But at the same time, here are my 4 principles. So I think there is some kind of internal contradiction between her trying to praise the complexity of cities and at the end of it actually reducing in some actionable ideas. So I think that's a good point to explore. I actually decided to, you know, after 10 years of, you know, doing this or that about Jane Jacobs, to kind of partially inspired to actually rethink some things and potentially write a new piece, because I think the pandemic brings to light some, I don't know whether they're problems or assets of Jane Jacobs' work that need a little further exploration. And, you know, perhaps I'm inviting an unnecessary level of controversy here, but we saw what happened with you know, with the pandemic, that we all thought that, I think, these are old-fashioned diseases, you know, like from the year 1900, where some epidemic can spread around the city, and, you know, people who live in closer quarters will be more likely to get infected. Yet it turned out that now it appears these are not old-fashioned diseases. Something new happened that actually brings back to light those pictures of the very, very dense city from white and black photographs from 100 years ago, and has necessitated some questioning within the urban planning profession, and whether that's warranted or not, I don't know, whether we actually must assume that concentration is better. What would have Jane said about social distance? You know, she always was for, you know, people congregating in very close quarters. Is there room for the social and spatial to, can you be socially close but spatially slightly distanced? On both these questions, is concentration better than social distance? I feel that because it is my job to tirelessly promote the efforts of our faculty. I mean, my colleague, our colleague Stephen Ramos has a great piece in Planning Perspectives, which considers health and density, I think, in a very innovative way. And he's about to have an edited volume soon to be published on the same topic. And for everyone who is interested in social and spatial distance, everyone should read the recent work of our colleague, Catherine Melcher. So there's another thing that I think the pandemic, there was a trend. It's been going on for some time, but only now it now has acquired a new kind of poignant need to readdress. I mean, her first principle, maybe not as well known as Jacob's density, but like in urban planning for sure, you know, there's this whole thing that you have to, thou shall mix the uses, you know, kind of in contradiction to what was done in the 20th century. Well, but I think the pandemic may have made this whole thing very easy, because I don't think the whole thing of whatever categories we have in our minds about residential, commercial, and industrial are now dead because people work from home. People shop from home. So what is the point of trying to encourage either the segregation or the integration of the land uses when the pandemic showed that they were in different historic circumstances? The very categorization, they can be split, because, you know, the home is your work and the work is your home. So how to even talk about this, I think, is a new question that we can discuss. And finally, I also think this is because of the pandemic, not that it wasn't here before the pandemic, and this question has been going around for a long time, but I think the pandemic made it more poignant. Her general emphasis on you can solve the problem, whatever the problem is, at the urban level and at the local level. And this is, of course, a wonderful thing, because I guess that's why we have citizen participation. But there are certain fundamental issues, I believe, that, not that I believe, but I think it's now widely discussed, that the pandemic made very clear. I mean, I'm not sure whether the solutions to all problems is necessary always at the local level. I mean, there are certain issues of environmental degradation, and now we know of public health, that it's not at all clear that if everyone can be as local as possible, whether that will actually contribute to both human and environmental health. And so I think that's a very kind of question that we struggle with, as not just as designers, but anyone who wants to make the world a better place, that we are revisiting. So I'm happy to discuss any of those. Thank you for listening for so long. I want to end with my particularly most favorite of Jane Jacobs' citations, which she used in an interview with Adam Gopnik, a very famous cultural critique art historian, who, by the way, will be lecturing at our very school in November. So, I'm doing a little advertisement ahead of that speech. And I just am, I can't really escape having to read aloud. I know you can read it too, but there's something about sharing aloud that particular piece of wisdom, which I really think is the urban wisdom of Jane Jacobs. I love New York. It's self-organizing. The most properly designed place cannot compete, because when you provide for everything, that's the worst thing you can provide. So there is a joke about the preacher who warns children, in hell there will be wailing and weeping and gnashing of teeth. And a child asked, what if I don't have teeth yet? And the preacher responded, teeth will be provided to you. And that is it, the spirit of the design city. So I think this is really the major contribution, or design projects in general, that Jane Jacobs made.